I remember the birth of this millennium. I'm quite surprised, however, that I do, because back then I really did everything I could so I wouldn't remember. In other words, I was drunk. I was really drunk. I was shit-faced. I was so drunk that I was dancing around, half naked, in the snow, on our village's marketplace. Luckily for me, that was somewhat socially acceptable behavior for a youth my age back then, where I lived. It was 16 years ago, after all. In the same year, when I was trying to get through puberty without too many scars, Perl 6 was announced. It took me some 5 years, though, before I first heard about it. In 2005, safely arrived in adulthood and quite a bit calmer, I wasn't that excited about Perl 6. I thought, okay, this is probably gonna be a nice update to the Perl I know and loved. They would probably remove some of the accumulated craft and add some niceties. But all in all, I was quite satisfied with the Perl I knew. By about 2007, I was hooked. I had seen some presentation and read about Perl 6, and the language really shaped up to be both easier to get into and insanely powerful at the same time. I also realized that this was a completely new language. I've seen Damien Conways' keynote where he told us that half of his modules are really trying to bring Perl 6 features back into Perl 5, and the other half would surely be rewritten soonish in Perl 6. But guess what? Shocking as this may come to some, we're not actually Damien Conway. And looking just at February's new CPAN releases, we have Business Payment Swiss ESR, P-Core GeoIP or Dancer Search App. There's loads and loads of special purpose modules that have nothing at all to do with improving the language and just happen to be written in it. So Damien's message that half of CPAN is obsolete anyway and the other half is surely going to be rewritten soonish might be a tiny bit optimistic. And that's exactly what I've experienced. In the past couple of years, I've seen more talks about Perl 6 and read about it and read blogs and the Perl 6 Weekly. And I was just itching to try it out. But whenever I thought about trying it out, I hit a wall. And I still don't mean this wall. It's more like a brick wall. And it's always the same brick wall, and I know it because it still had the same scratch marks from me from earlier attempts. At first it was database access, then templating modules, web frameworks, or an IMAP client. All the things I'm used to having as a Perl 5 programmer. And not to mention the 250,000 lines of code that we sit on at work and maintain. We start new projects twice a decade. And I'm actually trying to reduce that even further. It's like I can only have this cool new language which with all the power of its features, or CPAN and all the existing code. There's a rift there, and it not only separates our code bases, but also our communities. You're either a Perl 5 programmer with all your real-world connections, or one of those Perl 6 crazies with their high-floating ideas and castles in the sky. And for a time, it was even more dire. There were active hostilities between the two sides. Luckily, we have since overcome them. And thankfully, we have found some state of peaceful coexistence. But there's even been some exchange of ideas. But the sides are still quite clearly kept apart. One outcome of this exchange of ideas has been sane and powerful meta-object protocols for both Perl 5 and Perl 6. Just imagine what we could gain by an even more free flow of ideas. When instead of being content with living side by side, we would actually live together. I, for one, would love to live in such a future. Well, we will not get there overnight. But I can show you one important step in this direction today. This step will remove the most divisive decision you had to make. The question of whether you want to use this powerful new language features or all the existing code. My goal for today is that after this talk, you will be able to go out and give Perl 6 a real try. That missing modules or existing code bases no longer keep you from experiencing this great new language. Or, if you consider yourself a sixer already, that you will no longer restrict yourself to what's available in the currently existing Perl 6 module ecosystem. Because, as Perl programmers, we're usually not content with having our cake. Looking at some of those bellies, I would say we really like to eat them too. So, how do I want to accomplish that? Well, in one of the talks I mentioned, I've seen a thing called native call. Native call is Perl 6's way to access system libraries. Think Perl 6's access, but without all the horrors and the nightmares of C macros. Instead, native call is actually beautiful. Just look at this. With those couple of lines, you can load a library and access the functions in it. And you do not even need a C compiler installed to run this. When I saw this, it got me thinking. The Perl 5 interpreter is also provided as a library. If I can use native call to load Perl 5 and use its embedding interface, then in theory, I should be able to build a bridge. And literally within an hour of having this idea, I finished my very first Perl 6 program. This program used native call to load Perl 5 and run a hello world written in Perl 5 from within Perl 6. As hello world would have been a kind of awkward name, I called the resulting module Inline Perl 5. A couple of days later, I could use DBI, quickly followed by a DBX class, and I was like, wow, you're really onto something here. And this was a great start. But if I wanted to use Perl 6 in our projects, I'd have to ascend a much larger mountain. We use the Catalyst web framework for pretty much all our projects at work. So to be able to use Perl 6, I'd have to be able to do this from within a Catalyst-based project. And this is where we start looking at some code. Catalyst creates a start script for your application, so you can run the application using a Perl-based web server. Such a script may look like this. This is a fairly straightforward Perl script. We're basically just loading a module and call a method that this module provides, which does then do the real work. Now, how could we port this to Perl 6? If you look at the first line, I just replaced Perl by Perl 6. Setting the environment variable just got translated to a different syntax. It's otherwise completely the same. Then we load inline Perl 5. We create a new p5 object and call its run method, giving it a single string argument. Now, this is cool, but it could be nicer. Inline Perl 5 has a use method, which really does exactly the same as a use statement in Perl 5. That's basically just sugar, so you wouldn't have to use run just to load a module. Then there's invoke, which lets you, surprise, invoke methods on packages or objects. You just give it your package or object, the name of the method to call, and some additional arguments. Of course, the method may have one or more return values. And those get returned by invoke just like you'd expect it to. This quick example uses Perl5's petal templating module. We just create a new template object, and then we feed it some data in the form of a hash containing strings and lists. The method then returns a string, which we can print. As we can see, it's certainly possible to use Perl 6 modules, Perl 5 modules from Perl 6. But would you really want to program this way? It certainly could look much nicer. It could, it can, and it does. Perl 6 is already designed to accommodate interoperation with other languages. It allows for modules to hook into the use mechanism. With this, we can get rid of the P5 object entirely and literally use Perl 5 modules like we're used to. And even more, you don't even have to load inline Perl 5 yourself, because Perl 6 already mandates Perl 5 support. And Rakudo, the Perl 6 implementation, knows that inline Perl 5 can provide this support. So as long as you have inline Perl 5 installed, you don't have to worry about that anymore. When you use Perl 5 modules this way, inline Perl 5 will automatically create a corresponding Perl 6 package for you, including wrappers for all functions and methods. What if such a wrapper is actually wrapping a constructor? Well, they do what constructors do. They create objects. With this, you can just call a constructor as if the module was a real native Perl 6 class. The wrapper still just call invoke like we've seen in earlier examples. And again, this is complete and working code. This is everything you have to do to use XML XPath. Now for some real science fiction. What I've shown you so far allows you to use a large number of CPAN modules. However, some of them expect you to subclass them to actually use them. Basic bot or HTML parser would be examples. These inheritance-based APIs usually expect you to implement some methods. So how do you subclass a Perl 5 class in Perl 6? Turns out, you just do exactly the same as you would with an ordinary Perl 6 class. And indeed, that's exactly what happens. Inline Perl 5 creates a shadow class in Perl 6 for the package you load from Perl 5. You can just use this shadow class as a base class for your own class. The base class will still delegate all calls to methods that you do not override in your own class to the Perl 5 class. When you do override methods, they really are exactly what you'd expect from an ordinary Perl 6 class. We have methods and signatures and can use other methods provided by the base class. For example, reply or shut down for our IC bot. Starting up the bot is really just a matter of copy and paste from the documentation, modulo some syntax changes. And if you have seen this talk a year ago, I used to mention at this point some gotcha. I'm happy to report it's fixed and gone now, and this is really everything you have to do. HTML parser looks rather similar to what I've just shown. In fact, it's again some copy and paste with changed names. And again, we subclass the generated wrapper class, and we implement some methods. I very much like this result, especially with Perl 6's method signatures. It just makes the code very clean. However, if you've used HTML parser before, you might throw in at this point that you do not actually have to subclass HTML parser to use it. HTML parser also provides a functional interface. You could pass some code references to handle parse events. And by code references, I really mean that. HTML parser's XS implementation is rather inflexible and would, for example, not accept a callable object that just overrides the call operator. HTML parser is not the only module with this issue. So Inline Perl 5 nowadays gives you just that. If you pass a callable to Perl 5 code, this code will get a real, genuine code reference. Thus, even HTML parser will be happy. And again, I could just really do what the documentation told me to. Write some functions, pass the references to the constructor. Be done. Just for completeness, using our pretty printer class is as straightforward as you can imagine. With the knowledge we have now, we can use most of CPAN already. So, is it time to call a success and go have some coffee? Well, I'd like to pick my goals a bit higher than that. I'm not just looking for a treasure. I'm looking for the holy grail. I'm going for the big ones. And to me, that's Catalyst, that's DBX class. I want to do this. And if I'm starting to bore you already, I consider this a success because I'm really showing you the same trick for the third time now. It's just use from Perl 5. If you take one thing from this talk, it's use from Perl 5. So why am I making all this fuss? Why am I talking about grails? Well, while using a DBX class schema in this way is rather straightforward, wouldn't it be really cool if we were able to write a schema in Perl 6? Well, of course, since such schema classes are created by calling a couple of methods on the base class, this is not exactly a challenge either. But I'm lazy, and I hope you're too. I want to have my schema created by dbgdumper and then just extend it. But dbgdumper does create Perl 5 code. Surely you cannot just add some Perl 6 code, can you? Well, the top half of this slide is just plain normal dbx class schema code generated by dbgdumper, including the comments and checksums. Instead of just adding some methods in Perl 5, however, we used a special package called v6 inline. By using this package, we declare that the rest of this file is in fact written in Perl 6. And indeed, here we find the full title method that we've used in earlier slides. This method uses the generated accesses that dbg provides. Now, the bit to explain here is the rest of the use v6 inline line. What happens is that Inline Perl 5 automatically creates a subclass for us in Perl 5. This subclass is then used as the base class for our Perl 6 class, of the same name as the package we're in, dbg demo result cd in this case. Now, this is also then the class where our methods will be added to. So now when we create an object, we really want this to be an object of this Perl 6 class. And to achieve that, we have to wrap the constructors and redirect them to the Perl 6 class. Now, since constructors can have arbitrary names, and Inline Perl 5 cannot just guess their names, we simply have to tell it what they are called. In the case of dbx class result source, this would be new and inflate result. So, are you convinced yet that we really can use the awesome power of the fully armed and operational battle station that is CPAN? Well, I'm still not done yet. If you're a bit like me, you will ask the question, how Perl 6's threading features work with Perl 5? The answer is somewhat. You can create multiple independent Perl 5 interpreters and use them in different Perl 6 threads. These interpreters will not see each other and they will start out with a blank slate. But you can, however, plug them together on the Perl 6 side of your code and push values around. In fact, if you replace Perl 6 here in this example by Perl 5, you do exactly what iThreads does for you in Perl 5. As far as stability goes, it's better than I actually expected, but not yet something I'd really recommend. This is really bleeding edge. But it's fun to play around with in any case. So far, we've only talked about accessing Perl 5 code from Perl 6. For me, that's just not enough. I want to bring both languages together, and that means both directions. In other words, we need the bridge back. And this bridge is called Inline Perl 6. I told you earlier that Perl 5 is embeddable, and that I could use that for basis for Inline Perl 5. Well, Rakudo, or MoreVM to be more precise, is not. But I did it anyway. I just hope that we can get a real embedding interface in MoreVM one of those days, because then I could get rid of a lot of copied code. So what does it look like? On this slide you can see 3 ways to say hello world with Inline Perl 6. You always start by loading Inline Perl 6 and then initializing it. Then we use one of the functions that are all prefixed by v6:::. Run is for evaluating some code. There's call again for calling arbitrary named functions, and invoke to call a method. There are a couple of questions this code may raise. First, if you look at in the middle, there's the global added to the Meister. This is because in Perl 6, really everything is lexical, including class definitions. So if you just wrote class Meister there, it would only be visible within the eval that runs. So we have to make it global so we can actually use it in the following line. Then when invoking the new method, I need to pass named arguments. Well, Perl 5 doesn't have this concept. So I need to mark them as v6 named. Otherwise, Perl 6 would complain about additional positional arguments and not find the named values. The v6 name is also the reason why we have to initialize Perl 6 in a begin block. Because otherwise we would need parentheses around this, and it just wouldn't look that nice. Well, you may still remember this little script. It's the dbx class example I showed earlier, where I wrote part of a result set class in Perl 6. With the help of Inline Perl 6, we can still use this schema from Perl 5 code, including the Perl 6 extension. In fact, I'm quite confident in telling you that you can use every single feature I've shown you so far that works with Inline Perl 5, also in Inline Perl 6. And why is that? It's really just because Inline Perl 6 doesn't actually do that much. It really just loads MoreVM and Rakudo and Inline Perl 5. It tells Inline Perl 5 to use the already running Perl 5 interpreter. And it tricks MoreVM into thinking that it's actually just doing callbacks from C code. And that's why we have all the power still available, because it's really all Inline Perl 5 underneath. And yes, you can really have a Perl 6 module that uses a Perl 5 module and use this stack again in Perl 5. So after 15 years of growing apart, our code bases can finally start growing together again. The Perl community speaks in many languages, be it Perl 5, or regular expressions, or C, or Perl 6, or formats, or grammars. We speak in many languages, but it's always the same voice. It's the voice you can hear wandering around during the coffee breaks at conferences like this. It's the tiny, quiet voice at the back of your head that says, we are one. We are the Perl community. Because whatever the arguments, whatever the opinions, whatever our preferences are, at the end of the day, as long as it gets the job done and we have fun doing it, it just doesn't matter which part of our toolbox we use. As long as we recognize this singular truth that we are one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And by talking faster than you anticipated, we actually have a bit more time than usual for questions. So if there are any questions from the audience, I will hand over the microphone.
Okay. You had this begin block with the inline Perl 6 initialize call.
Yep.
Can't you just do that as part of the inline Perl 6 import method, because that's called at begin time by use? Why do you need an extra method?
I probably can. The truth is that Inline Perl 6 has not seen all that much of my development time. I got it to work. You can use it for everything. The API itself may need a bit of updating and actual experience from real-world users.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, more questions? I'm trying to get around here.
I think this is very exciting. However, I'm wondering, is this just a really cool toy, or is it a really production quality approach? In other words, are all problems solved, or are only the weird and really hard to debug ones left?
Well, in my opinion, and I'm probably a bit biased there, it is going very well in the production direction. And I very much anticipate actually using it in our production system starting this year. I think most of the real hard problems are already solved. Yeah, there's not much left, really. Since even the subclassing thing happens to work quite well nowadays, and I'm satisfied with the API. I wouldn't know what to do, actually.
So, more questions? Over here.
Do you have any experience with Perl 5 modules using XS code? If I can ask it this way.
Well, as in, for example, DBI, which worked since about an hour after I started the project. Yes, access is really not an issue at all. That's the whole point of the project.
So I have one question myself.
Yep.
What about Perl 5 code that uses threads and tries to use inline Perl 6 at the same time? I mean, it's bad enough it uses threads itself.
Well, I've no knowledge of anyone ever trying it. I would be certainly interested in someone trying it. My guess is that it wouldn't actually be a problem. As I've shown, you can already use multiple interpreters in different Perl 6 threads, and iThreads in Perl 5 cannot get any worse than that.
So I challenge you. I challenge everybody here to prove Stefan wrong and submit bug reports.
Sounds like fun.
So, more questions? All right, we still have about 5 to 10 more minutes, actually.
Are exceptions marshaled across the Perl 5, Perl 6 boundary? I mean, if Perl 5 code throws an exception, do you get then a Perl 6 exception?
You do, and I should include that in my examples. Yes, good idea.
Okay. But you probably can't use goto from Perl 5 to go to a... because labels in Perl 5 are dynamically scoped. You can just go to out of a nested subroutine call. I don't think you can go to a Perl 6 label from there.
You're weird. I like that. We should talk together.
Actually, Perl 6 doesn't implement goto yet. It's specified but not implemented. So that kind of puts the bar very high here. At least in one direction, from Perl 5 to Perl 6. Well, next and last might be easier because they're implemented as control exceptions in Perl 6. So you might be able to actually generate the proper control exceptions from within. Anyway, this is going too far right now.
Well, as we seem to have a bit time left, I do actually have 2 bonus slides with things you might want to know. You probably didn't notice, but the DBX class example was not 100% plain DBX class code as you would write it in Perl 5. There's an important difference between Perl 5 and Perl 6. Because while Perl 6 adds a lot of features, it also removed some. For example, a constant source of bugs and surprises, the distinction between list and scalar context is gone in Perl 6. Unfortunately, DBX class makes extensive use of this context sensitivity. Most of all in the result set method, which either gives you a list of all the results in this context or another result set object in scalar context. Fortunately, it also provides a solution in the form of the _RS versions of all the modules that return result sets. So for now, it's much better to use those in Perl 6 code. I do actually have an idea how to get around that, and I hope one of these days I'm gonna have the chance to try it out and remove another obstacle. Another feature that was removed is references. We usually don't need them anymore since we can pass around arrays and hashes just as they are. In other words, we could say we removed references or we have everything by reference now. Again, DBX class does make use of references. Scalar references, to be precise. It uses those to mark literal pieces of SQL. In Perl 5, you can create a reference to any variable using the / operator. In Perl 6, this creates a capture instead. A capture captures the arguments you pass to a function, that is, positional or named arguments. This is a concept that does not really exist in Perl 5. It has nothing at all to do with references, but it looks kind of the same. So Inline Perl 5 misuses captures to give you a way of creating references you can pass to Perl 5. So for you, this means that you just have to add the parenthesis to what you would usually write in Perl 5 code. And with this, you can really use DBX class just like you're used to. Okay, but this is really it.
Well, thanks again.